Good? Okay. Dean, can you hear me? Well, I'm sure everyone's probably hungry for lunch. I'm probably sitting right in the middle of it. So we might get started about a minute early. That way we can maybe finish a minute or two early ahead of time. So well, I'll go ahead and get started with some quick intros so we don't have to bleed into the rest of the session on that. My name is Andrew Welchel. You might figure out from some logos and stuff like that. I'm from Savient. You'll see like my letters and that type stuff here at the end of the slides. As you're following along, just to say, operational note is that if you're interested in the slides, there's a copy that's available. There'll be a QR code at the very end that has some information. And then Terry was kind enough to post the slides actually to the AFCEA. So if you don't get one of the cards or don't get a picture of the other, you can actually hop back on the AFCEA website for agenda, which I'd highly recommend. It's a great website. It's got all the rest of the information for today. It's got a link to the slides as well. So multiple ways to get to it, which is always great. I kind of say I used to work more in the authentication side. It's always great to have multiple MFAs, great to have multiple ways to get to your data on the access side. So it's hitting 12:30. We'll go ahead and get started. So our topic today is a bit of a jumble, but we talk about identity access, we talk about zero trust, but there's a real objective, and it's about acceleration of the mission. We're always going a certain speed, but if we can increase that rate of speed and we can increase the agility, meaning we can pivot when new challenges come or when new opportunities for technologies are there, that's always great and is really making the mission better as we deliver as well. So one thing we're going to be talking about the focus area we're going to be talking about is a unified network. And with that unified network, it does have some challenges. It has humongous opportunity, but it has some challenges in that how can we take and you can look at the challenges as opportunities actually, how can we take some existing cloud type technologies and mix that with the need to be able to access that anywhere. When I say anywhere, it's not just anywhere inside of a geography, but rather anywhere inside of a physical, like for instance, an actual vehicle versus just a geography, right? So we're talking about how do we get this into a truck, into a field piece of equipment, et cetera, and leverage that there. We're going to be talking about the reference example of machine learning AI as one of these technologies that we've got great access to in the native cloud, but how can we actually deliver that? And we'll be talking about how zero trust helps us do that in that particular scenario. We're kind of seeing little examples of that here to the left. Now, before I get too started on, and if no one's convinced of the power of artificial intelligence, specifically machine learning, this is one quick example. So won't spend a lot of time on it. I could actually have a wonderful, fun time topic for 3 or 4 hours talking about supervised versus unsupervised learning, but we're going to stay focused today. But this one slide kind of captures a really great use case and the power of it. The Air France Flight 447, if you might be familiar with it, happened several years ago. Wasn't that quite long ago? But there was a company up in, actually before they did it, they tried to find this flight, and they're doing traditional search patterns, doing grid patterns, et cetera, crisscross. No one could find it. The problem was they could not use the data where search patterns failed. Now what happened was one guy from a company up in Reston, Virginia, he kind of came back and said, hey, I think I can solve that. And literally within a matter of weeks, he solved it using machine learning methods where he not only used a target set of data, but he actually used the failed data to inform the next search pattern. So long and short, he was able to find that aircraft there, get the black box, and presumably they could actually leverage that for future flights, avoid issues. But the big thing is it just shows the power that you can use it for in that scenario. Now, when we're actually looking at machine learning and looking at capabilities, it's good to look at the outcomes first. Like, where do we want to go and deliver this? We certainly want to have, if you can deliver this, has certain outcomes. So having a converged data plane gives you clear visibility for joint operations. So certainly as we're doing more things together, being able to see where things are coming together is important. The other element is being able to see cloud scale. So when you talk about the traditional native cloud, you'll talk about to AWS, Azure, etc. Inside that native cloud, you got immense compute power, but you can't always bring that with you inside of a truck or inside of a vehicle. So really what we're talking about is being able to capture that, take it with us, and then leverage it for even disconnected operations if you need to do that. The last one is almost as important as the others. We hear a lot of people talk about user experience. What does that actually mean? That means about making it easy to implement, use, etc., and upgrade. It's in simple terms, it's got to be easy, or it's not going to be used. Now, certainly, as more holistic things, we want to see other things happen. If we do it right, we'll see observations of what happens when you do it right. We'll see reduced cyber risk as it happens. We'll see increased agility. I mentioned before about being able to pivot across missions, and then also that whole organizational speed, which is really about how fast can you bring new technology in. So really, when you look at ICAM and when you look at Zero Trust, it's not just about delivering a single technology, but it also creates an accelerator for the next technology, kind of like a ball bearing in that sense. There we go. Now, to pivot that outcome, to get to the outcome, we also want to see some positive benefits. So if you look at some of those positive benefits, there are certain things, and I block these into specifically within the machine learning and AI use case, so you can kind of frame it right, at least to kind of get very specific. So one specific thing in challenges is that how do we get AI-enabled operators or AI capabilities actually out to the field? Well, the hardest thing is to get that expertise out there, right? We want to be able to get people out there, bring them back, redeploy to different places. So the whole onboarding and offboarding is a really substantial challenge. So as we can do these types of things, we'll see the methods and capabilities in just a moment. But as we can do that, certainly the onboarding and offboarding will be helpful. The next element that's important is the modernization. I've seen it before, and this isn't just a DoD or this industry challenge, but I've seen it in hospital situations as well, is where literally you have technology sitting on the dock, but there's a perception of risk until you get that risk in is literally sitting on the dock. So there's a huge opportunity for Zero Trust and ICAM, identity access, to lower that risk, and all of a sudden we can accelerate that pipeline, which is great for everybody. Now the last key element is really kind of when these first two things start happening together, you now got something happening that can kind of succeed that and go very well, which is really about getting the mission elements enabled for for the AI models faster. And this is getting slightly technical, right? But the very first thing a lot of times you want to do is get access to the data. You want to see data more real time. Well, now there's opportunities. Once you get these elements first talked about there, you can actually take these AI models that people are talking about, you hear about in the cloud, you can actually get them out into the field. So all really great potentials, but we need to get there first. Now, how do we get there? There's three capabilities specifically within AI machine learning that we're targeting, looking at. The very first one, and these tie back down to identity access and risk management from that perspective. So the very first one, for all the RMF geeks out there, we're talking about the AC6 and the related controls, and really about least privilege. And what we're doing is taking that least privilege concept and then mapping it back down to where we're living here. So the very first one is really about limiting access to AI and AI models with time bounding, right? So if you can imagine all these stories about zombie accounts and those types of things, that doesn't exist on the enterprise, this exists in service accounts as well. So we want to be able to put time bounding for these AI models when they're running and know when they're running and how they're getting applied to what. The second one, which is almost as important, maybe more important, is we're not in artificial intelligence machine learning, we're typically not doing operating with a GUI every single time. If you think about how the operational model of AI works in machine learning, it's typically on either a machine to machine or it's a person to machine. So there's always a machine level discussion going on. So that typically involves an API. And so it's key to protect that API. And so a part of that discussion is very much what, for instance, the presenter in front of us talked about with multi-factor. It's certainly important to be able to protect that session when it starts, but you want to make sure that session when it's running has as limited and constrained access when it runs as well. Now the last one is certainly important as well, because And this is a little bit particular to artificial machine learning in that you have a data pool that actually exists in the cloud, Azure, AWS, whichever it might be. And that data cloud you're actually using to make decision processing out in the field, right? Because of the way it works, it's reprocessing and it's generating models. Those models are getting pushed out in the field, and all of a sudden, you're helping use that for decision making. So the integrity of that data is key. You want to make sure you know who has access to that data, and then how they're, does someone else need to be into it, et cetera. So again, having time bound, there's a concept called zero standing access, where you're not going to assume everyone has access all the time forever. And you want to be able to make sure that least privilege is applied across the board. So all this is great as far as a concept, but you can also see it's kind of covered up. But you can see where this also meshes back into the existing native cloud and certainly the tactical edge, right? You want to be able to protect this all the way from one side to the other. Now, if I were you, I'd be watching, is this really about machine learning or is this about risk reduction? Well, this is really about risk reduction. And so what we're talking about is what is that process that we'd want to go through to actually make sure that on every type of scenario, you've got a consistent way to actually reducing risk as you get access to those resources. So really, if you think about what's actually in the field, the real targets of this risk reduction is the users and their assets, right? We're talking about infrastructure as a services, application services, privilege applications, again, all existing on platforms that are out in the field. They could be some reachback services, but at the end of the day, we want to protect those assets that are getting leveraged. There's several steps to that, but the first one is certainly understand where those elements can live. There's two places where information can be collected and leveraged. So the first one is, I'm using saving as an example. There's a place where for insider threat risk, understanding the threat landscape. From that side, you can have something that looks at the policies and say, hey, how much should someone have access? Is it, if you want to have separation of duties to make sure that someone doesn't have too much access, and then at the same time, can we consume data from the other elements? But really what the rest of the process looks like is kind of making that first step to say, hey, how much access, or what do I need to request for? Because when you make that request, you want to get visibility to risk. Because sometimes, if someone's making a request for something that's very high access, they didn't realize it, they can step back and do a little self-management. But sometimes you need it to do your job. So the next step is really to go to an approval process. And even if you have a service account, this applies to those as well. You have a case where a service account unknowingly may be requesting access for much broader sets of missions and access that's not needed. You might want to taper that back down some. And as we go through this, you heard me use a concept of no standing access. That's a concept of kind of making sure that someone doesn't just have access all the time in perpetuity. So there's certainly a concept of doing a review and certification. This is to make sure that end of a deployment, end of a TDY, or even just if there's not one specified, but at least once a year or so, you can have a chance to go verify, is this person still assigned? Do they need this level? And if not, again, do a cyber risk reduction, bring that back down. Now, where this really gets mature and kind of interesting is where we can kind of take that state. We know that we're going every once in a while, kind of doing a quick check, a health check to say, hey, does everyone really have the amount that they need, or they have too much? But you know what? What happens inside those timelines, right? You have timeline A, point A, another year or 6 months, point B, but something might happen in between. You want to have the way to kind of consume data as well as kind of do internal analytics to kind of figure out, hey, did something happen? Did someone actually get more access than needed between the last time? Or are you getting information from threat hunters that identified a compromised laptop and we know who the user is? Well, if you know who that user is, you may want to actually reduce risk for all the rest of the applications as well. So certainly being able to consume that is very important. Now, as we do that, we actually need to be able to deploy this. So the last part of it was just a process, like what process do we go through? But actually what we do here is we twist that around and say, okay, what would it look like if we deployed that? So we need parts and pieces, we need comms to go back and forth. And then so this actually is an architecture representation of what's happening now at used to be ITAS, now it's A365. So some people may sometimes ask, well, why is that particular element? Well, the reason is because we just happen to be using Azure AD in that particular case. As you deploy it to tactical environments, it will probably be some kind of different IDP. But just for this reference discussion, it's kind of the same substantial concept. We're trying to achieve the ability to enable someone to make a request by using the elements on the bottom. know what they need access to. You can certainly then use the CAC, or if you did MFA, you can get those resources, and when you're done. The key thing that's part of this Zero Trust conversation is also consuming those elements at the top. You see the Defender and the Sentinel consuming the EDR and the SIM elements in that process as well. So we've got the pieces hooked up, we got the process, but the question still is, how do we actually connect that to the field and leveraging that? Again, remembering, this is an overall architecture. We haven't really plugged this into the actual machine learning aspects to it yet. So let's do that. So if we take both those elements we just talked about and saw it a minute ago, and flip that around, and kind of now answer the question, well, what does it look like when we take that process and mesh that into a machine learning AI scenario? Well, what's really going to change is the elements in the center that you're going to be affecting, right? So what's now really different is if you saw those elements we talked about before, we saw those three big elements. We saw the AI data pool, we saw the machine learning models that were out there, and we kind of had some stuff in the middle, some compute infrastructure, some APIs. So we still have the same orientation. Again, you see the AI data pool on the right. Let me go back here. You see the AI deployed model. You also have some field deployed apps. So again, that same flow or orientation of where you got apps on the right, you got the other to the left. But now what we've done is we've actually meshed that with the rest of the cyber risk reduction process from an identity access, and really start with the first process like we talked about, which is making that initial request. So that request could come in the form of requesting to say, hey, I need to submit to take the service account and enable it for access to run these calls. Well, that's fine, but we need to run it and find out, hey, is that service account already used for something else, right? Do you need a new one? Do you need to constrain the access if you need to, or time bound it? And then in that process, we might find out we may take a step back and do something else. You know, the next step, which is currently important, is actually now, again, getting that approval or getting a review. And that same person sometimes might have more of a global view or a broader set of risk visibility, and you can possibly bring that down. And there may be a recommendation to say, hey, could you use a different service account, time bound it, et cetera, do some kind of other mitigation. Now, we talked about a speed and we talked about agility. So part of that speed and agility is about being able to rapidly get this out. So what kind of good is it if we can have a whole lot of, if we automated the paper process, right? We automated 2875, that's wonderful, but now we got to go manually reach out and touch things, right? So in this case, we really want to combine the ability to kind of reach out and touch those elements. Maybe it's if it's field deployed, it's an Active Directory, might be a local database, et cetera, but you want to make sure you have the ability to reach out to those things. And at the touch of the button, as soon as it's approved for that access, you can go out and have it available. Now, we briefly talked about the rotation of roles, you know, maybe going on TDYs, maybe going on mission assignments, et cetera. So eventually your role is going to change. That's just part of life. But we make sure we need to change the level of access with that, right? And then sometimes what happens is that access is going to change, and you're going to need, that access is going to change, and sometimes you're going to have access will assign locally, but we want to have visibility to that at the same time. So sometimes if it was changed locally, it happened outside the governance tool, it's really great to get that visibility. Now, I briefly mentioned about what does this look like when we combine this with external sources. So if you've got a threat hunting team, or whether it's in your organization or kind of outside the organization, peer organization, they're going to eventually come to you and say, hey, we found something, what can we do about it, right? Well, if you can connect those teams together, now this is an opportunity where you can take that information that has been validated and is ready to do something, is actionable. Now you can actually take action with a platform such as this to actually reach out and with an API call, at least minimum, make them aware of it, or if it's severe enough, you can actually shut down access for that particular person. So now this is kind of how that access works from we've now meshed those models. If we kind of take it to the next step, the next question is, well, how does that actually translate into like field sets of capabilities? So really what we're talking about is the same capabilities I mentioned this was deployed out at A365. Really talking about taking that same sets of capabilities for authorization, reaching out to endpoints, compressing it, looking at some hardware platforms, and then making it available, right? So what we're really talking about is saying, hey, what does it take to run this? There's a set of services, as an example. as I go to the right. So, certainly you've probably heard about containerization. So not only is that great for overall general use, but it certainly actually makes it easier to deploy these elements out in the field as well. So what we're really talking about is the ability to take all those services you see on the right, which is necessary to run what you see on the left, and then what you see in the center is really kind of a sample representation of a scenario, or you can certainly get it smaller as well. But then really there's the opportunity to get that kind of authorization capability down to the field level in that sense. I mean, it could be a command post, it could be an actual vehicle, that type thing. Now there is a further discussion, which is if this is so great in the native cloud, and this is so great in actually in the vehicle, well, why couldn't it also be really useful across AORs or across communities? So in that sense, if someone was asking that or thinking about that, you're absolutely right. It could be extremely useful. So in that particular case, what we're now doing is expanding out the data fabric, right? So this is not just a valuable at the local field unit level, but actually is valuable for from that whole sensor to whatever you're going to take it to. So now you have, in this case, let me go out a little bit farther. We've got adapted means to leverage to use the capability, and then in different cases we're just changing the termination point of what the network looks like, right? So what you're also seeing is a consistency of CSP network access, so it makes that part easy, and then we're just changing the termination point as far as connectivity. It could be a physical building you're connecting to with a DISN connection, or it could be some more modern 5G connections in those type scenarios. So, there we go. So certainly, I won't kind of read through all these specifically, but the biggest thing I emphasize is two things. It's absolutely worthwhile to go ahead and make plans and to do some testing. Also plan, as if you guys have read Frederick Brooks back at IBM days, he always had a saying of the mythical man month, to quote from that, is plan for the one to fail, right? Meaning that it be iterative, right? It's kind of a historical version of agile. Plan for one to fail, be iterative, learn from it, and repeat and proceed. So I'll kind of pause here. We do have a QR code. We're at 604 if you want to come by, ask any questions. And as mentioned before, the QR code has the slides. AFCEA is they've got the wonderful agenda website. We've got the slides actually posted up there as well. And I'll pause here for any questions. And no questions too. That's fine. I will, we got the slides up. It's actually got my contact on there. Got it on the QR code. So happy to answer if you come back with any follow-ups. And I do realize I'm keeping you from eating, although you could have walked off and just gone and ate. So I appreciate that. Thank you a whole bunch, and enjoy lunch and have a great show.